So the first thing that we are going to do is we are going to mark what color goes where. Generally what I do for the sky is I just mark all of the sky bits, but there are a few pieces that are a little bit tricky in this pattern that I want to bring to your attention. So all of these that I'm coloring blue are going to be sky, and I like to mark these out in a color or, see, that was one. So J2 is very tricky, and you might be tempted to mark it as sky, but it is not. That is one that tripped me up before. So the reason that I go through and I mark these, I prefer to use a color, but sometimes I do just write on them what color they are going to be or what they are going to be used for, is so that when I get into my groove of sewing, I know exactly which color is going to go where. So this is going to be, I'm going to actually write on these because I'm going to use the text fabric here and the text here. And then for J2, that is also part of the column where we're going to be using text. So I'm going to write on the XT. On this, I sometimes call this the danger zone, but the seam allowance, I'll just write there, and then I'm also going to write here that H2 is text. So what you should have for the fabric that I will be using as text will be A1, J2, B1, and H2. Those will all be the center part of the Jefferson Memorial, and I will be using the fun text fabric. Okay, so for the next part, I'm going to mark which ones are for my trees. So that will be K1, M1, E1, F1, and H3. Now, for this part up here, it's going to be the mirror because we sew on the back of the fabric, and then when we open it up, we'll have the front of the fabric. So this picture on page 4 of the instructions are, or the pattern as well, this is the front, and then these are the back. And this part will come into play later when we are laying all of it out. I use this as a reference to know, okay, these are the pieces that all go together, and if you line them up in the way that they're shown here, you might be a little bit confused. So I usually lay them out in this order so I know where they go. Okay, so for the next one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, because I have some print fabrics, I'm going to mark J1 and H1 as plaid, because these are going to be the plaid. Okay, and then for I2, H4, and L1, these are all going to be the burlap textured fabric that I have here. And then this was just a light gray. And then for the dome, for C1, I have, let's see, that's not the right one. This is the right one. I set it down over here. I have a variegated, I might, so I had a little bit of a mishap between when I filmed the pulling of the fabric and sewing, and my computer would not transfer the video over. So I'm having to re-sew it, and some of these I don't have enough of the fabric anymore. So I'm kind of having to come up with a few things maybe on the fly. So for the dome, I had anticipated using a gradient fabric, and it looks like I don't have enough of the lighter color. So we'll use this darker color. It'll give the same effect as the darker color. Okay, so for the part that I was going to use for the gradient is C1, B4, and B2, which I will now be using this gray. All right, now what we want to do is press the fabric, and then we will subcut. I'm going to leave these, I did not mark D2, or D1. Pardon me, D1 is also text. Okay, so just give a look over all of your pieces, make sure that they are labeled. I always label everything. It just makes it so much smoother if you label it in advance. Okay, so let's start with, we're going to press everything and then we will subcut the pieces that we need. And the subcutting is just like you would for any sort of quilting that you want to subcut into manageable pieces. So what I like to do, and you can do this two ways, you can cut them out or you can use a ruler. So I eyeball, I'm going with this darker gray, which is this one here, the darker gray color, and then I just look and see how wide it's going to be, and I always go a little bit over, so I think I'm going to go 1/8 of an inch past the 2.5 inch, and I always use the same side of the ruler. I'm giving myself extra over here and a little bit extra over here just in case anything shifts, just in case I need to trim anything. I just like to have a little bit of overage. And then the widest I will need is about here. Okay, so that'll be nice. And then I always like to just double measure, and I need to cut extra, so I'm going to cut over. I'm going to give myself a little bit of extra. Okay, so this is for the darker gray, and then just set that aside. And then you can continue this process for all of the pieces. For the burlap section, you want to make sure that you have enough of the fabric going in the same direction. So for this one, I'm going to be cutting it this way instead of this way. This is the this would be the width of the fabric, but I like the way that it looks lengthwise. And I know that I will need another length of this so that I can get both sides of the stairs in. For the trees, what I am going to do is cut them out and then show you how I kind of fussy cut these a little bit. It's not going to be an exact fussy cutting like you would with English paper piecing. You can do that. This is just kind of a rough estimate, so based kind of on just generally where I want the tree portion to be. So I lay the fabric face down and I have my template face up, and I'm going to measure this section where I have the tree. That's going to be the most notable tree, and I usually go up to the next 1/8 or 1/4 inch, and this is right on an 1/8 inch line, so I'm going to go up to the 1/4 inch, marking where my thumb is. And I'm looking for this kind of area because I need to have the tops of the trees for E1 and F1. So I want to make sure that I have H3 down far enough where it's not going to be catching the blue portion too much. And I want kind of this trunk area. So I kind of have it centered where I want, and I'm just going to cut this strip up this way. And then I turn it around. And again, I give myself a little bit of extra because I might decide that I want it somewhere else. So I do want to have a little bit of flexibility. So this is just how I'm doing it for this one. Sometimes I am far more precise, but I don't really know if I want it closer or if I really want it center. So I'm just giving myself a little bit of flexibility. So for this one, I'm just going to set it off to the side, and then when we come back to it, I will show you how I get this to be exactly where I want it to be. So I will walk you through that piece, and then I save these because I will need them for E1 and F1. Actually, I might, well, no, I'd rather have a top. I was thinking that I might want this part for either M or K, but I think I'm going to set these off to the side, and you know, I might even decide that I want something different. So then I repeat the same process for M and K. The fabric goes face down. It's easiest to cut it when it's face down because you know that the fabric is going to go in the right place. And then I'll go up to the next one. And I will repeat the process. And this one is going to go more in the center. And I'm not too concerned about cutting into the center of these fabrics because I bought it specifically so that I would. So sometimes if you buy fabrics that are so pretty and you don't want to cut into them, they might not be the right ones to use for a project like this. I'm willing to sacrifice a lot of the fabric so that I get the parts that I want, because that's how I am painting with the fabric, so to speak. So to me, it doesn't become a sacrifice of, you know, sacrificing fabric because it's how I wanted it to look. Now, if I was sacrificing a whole yard for just one little bit, I think I might be a little bit more apprehensive about it, but in general, that's kind of my feelings. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through one of these tree parts, how I sew these lines. I will walk you through my method of, it's always the same method. And then I will sew all of these together because it's the same method for all of them. Then when it comes time for the directional fabrics, I will show you that part, and then the last part of the video is putting all of the template pieces together. You really don't need to see me sewing in real time all of the different pieces because it's really the same method for each of these. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm taking K1. This is the first one that I am going to be working with, and I sort of want this branch somewhere here, and I want kind of some of this foliage as well. And I know that I need to have enough room so that I have a 1/4 inch seam. I have this 1/4 inch seam right here, and it's going to connect enough up over here. So this line will kind of extend right here, and this is getting to be a little bit shorter than the 1/4 of an inch that I like, but there's still plenty of room. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hands off and I am going to put a little bit of glue on the back side of the template. Now what I'm going to do, because now this is stuck, it's not going to go anywhere. I can trim off the excess that I don't need, and I find that if I do this now, it becomes so much easier for me to set up all of the other pieces. I don't score all of the template pieces, especially these ones. I don't score them in advance. And what happens, especially with these ones, is if you score them all in advance, you have now a whole curve that's become weakened. And what happens with paper is if you fold it over multiple times and you keep folding it, then it becomes really weakened and brittle. And especially once you start sewing in it and puncturing little holes, then the integrity of the template has been compromised. And the beauty of foundation paper piecing is that we have a lot of precision and we have a lot of available detail. But the downside is our template can become really weakened. So I only score the first one, sometimes a few in advance, but generally not. And I'm not looking for a really crisp line. I'm just pressing it right up against the side, and I'm just kind of using the pads of my finger instead of my fingernail. And then I'm going to fold it over and I'm going to crease it from edge to edge. Now on my ruler, I find that the dotted line, the dashed line, is much easier to use, and it has a 1/4 inch note on the side. The other side that's a little bit more solid is not as precise. This one is really much easier to use. So check out your rulers. It could be really common that one side is more precise than the other. So I always use the same side of the ruler, and this really helps all of the pieces come together really nicely. So if you see me flip around my ruler, that's why. The other thing that I do is I line the dotted 1/4 inch line along the top of the folded edge of the template. So they're right on top of each other. And then I cut along. So now I have my 1/4 inch marking. And we always sew right sides together. So I'm going to take my next piece. It's a little bit more tricky to see with a solid fabric because there isn't necessarily a right or a wrong side. So the next thing that I'm looking for is I'm looking for, does the template or does the fabric extend beyond the template? And we're only working with the part that we're going to be sewing. So you can lift it back up and you can see that K2 or any of the 2s, you put your fabric in the 1 and then you have your second piece in the 2 section. You fold over the template and your fabric needs to be covering this area here, but it also needs to extend a 1/4 inch this way because we'll be removing that. And you can see that I am just right on the side of that 1/4 inch. That's going to be just perfect. So then I like to pin these together so that they stay right where I put them. And I like to have my pins a little bit farther back than the seam line so that I can get really close to the pins, and if I don't need to remove them, then I don't remove them. Okay, so before you start sewing, it is important to make sure that your needle is in the center of your presser foot, and make sure that your stitch length is lowered to about 1.5, around in that area. You don't need to go a lot lower than 1.5. It can be really difficult to remove stitches if you go much lower than that. So I find that 1.5 is a really nice place to be. If you don't have 1.5 millimeters on your machine, lower your stitch length to somewhere where you think it's going to be a shorter stitch length. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sew a little bit in front of the sew line to a few stitches beyond the stitch line. You don't need to back stitch, just like this. This is usually a little bit farther than what I sew, but just a few stitches before and a few stitches after, and what that will do is it will lock in your stitch, and you don't need to have any sort of a back stitch, and then stitch right along that line. And if we fold this over, now we have a 1/4 inch seam line. So you can see that there's no funny math, no magic, even though it still feels really magical. And then press your template over. What I didn't say before is you need to make sure that when you sew, you have your template opened back up. So we're going to press that so the seams go in one direction in this, and then generally I like to sew the seams open later. And then we're going to leave a little bit of a space trimming, again, just in case any sort of mistakes happen. So I trimmed off the extra fabric that I don't need. And then we're going to repeat the step previously. We're going to score along the sew line, along the solid line. And then we will fold back and trim 1/4 of an inch. And then we line this up. And I put my fingers right along the where the cut line is going to be to see how much extra do I have. And my fingernail is underneath, so I can see that I have about a 1/16 of an inch, and that's quite enough. I'm comfortable with that. And since I know that the fabric extends to about right here, there's plenty of fabric here and there's going to be plenty of fabric here. So I'm most concerned about what is going to be in this area. And there's plenty of fabric there. So I'll fold the template back over so it's open. And then I'm going to stitch along the line. Really quick before I continue, one thing that I notice a lot with beginner foundation paper piecers is that they are leaving the template open. Because I have this here, I'm going to grab another piece of fabric. So one common mistake is that they will think I need to have something in this space if I have the fabric open. So what they will do is they will take the edge of the fabric down here and make that 1/4 of an inch with this section here. And what happens is that if we sew along this area, we have nothing to fold over. We have only 1/4 of an inch. So that's why it's imperative to fold your template over, score along that line, fold it over, and then line up your fabric so that you have 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And I want to reiterate that when you are sewing your pieces together or laying them out, it's only the first piece that goes face down, and then the template goes on top of that. You glue the template just in the section, and then you trim the extra bit, and it's only the first piece that goes face down with the wrong sides of the template and the fabric matching, and then everything after that is always with the right sides together. We never sew with the next piece facing down, because once it opens up you can see that it would be wrong side out and the right side out. So the correct way would be like this, with the wrong side or the right sides together, and then we open it up the same as you've always sewn. So let's sew this together. Again, same, I haven't changed anything with my sewing machine. I'm going to be sewing right along the center of the line. A few steps, or a few stitches before, a few stitches after. You can see how that looks. And then we'll just press this section. What I like to do with the last piece that I sew is, especially for these smaller blocks, I like to put a little bit of glue down. Actually, I have to say for larger blocks it's really true as well. I like to have the fabric stay put. I have gone to the effort of sewing precisely along the line. I want to make sure that the fabric stays put when I sew all of my template pieces together. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to line the 1/4 of an inch side of my ruler up along the sew line. I have a sew line here all the way around the edge. So the 1/4 of an inch dashed line on top of the sew line, and I'm going to cut along the edge. What I am not going to be doing is I'm not going to be lining up the edge of my ruler with the edge of the template here. There are too many variables, and I find that if I do that, my template becomes off, and then I become frustrated because it hasn't come together the way I had anticipated. So using the edge to cut, but the 1/4 inch to line everything up. then my head isn't wiggling all over the place, and it just is so much easier this way. Now for these little tab bits, if you have glue in kind of this area, you want to make sure that it's going to stay put. The glue is water soluble. I just use a Scholastic school glue from the office supply store. I like one that is clear or dries clear as opposed to one that is purple, because the purple one tends to burn. And then I use scissors and I trim along that line. This is not quite as important as the 1/4 of an inch seam with the side of the ruler. So that is done. Okay, so for this piece, we're going to talk a little bit about directional fabric and how to get your fabric going in the right direction. It's a little bit of an advanced technique, but I am fully confident that you will be able to pick it up quite easily. So I'm going to start this the same way that I've done my other blocks, with a little bit of glue on the back end. And what I did not do is I didn't fold this over so that I can see. Here's one place where I kind of break my rule a little bit. And I want to make sure that I have a 1/4 of an inch down here. So I'm going to trim off this. And then I'm going to trim off this top section here. Okay, so when we have directional fabric, one thing that is very imperative to know is that we're following the same steps. We just have to think a little bit more about how all of it is coming together. So one of the first things that you might be tempted is to just flip over your fabric and cut a little bit, and that's not going to be the right way. What we need to do is we need to have the right side facing up, because our right sides have to go together. However, we have to pay attention to what's going on with the template. So here we want the text to be going across, horizontal. And there are a couple things that we could do wrong. If we want the text, I'm going to write this on the back side as well and really hope that the pen doesn't bleed through. So one thing that we might be tempted to do is line it up like this with the top of the fabric. And if you have a non-directional fabric, then that's absolutely what I would recommend for you to do. And what happens if we do this is our text is not only upside down, but it's going off to the side. This becomes more apparent if I turn it this way. That the 1/4 of an inch seam is underneath, and you can see that the text is going this way and my template is going this way. So they're turned a little bit. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. The next thing that you might be tempted to do is, well, all I will do is I'll just keep moving this until the text is going in the right direction. So what you could do is you could line up this line with the raw edge, the open edge of the template, and that would be absolutely correct, but we're missing one step. The thing that has happened is we've flipped over the template, so now it is upside down. So this is the only time that you will have to turn your fabric around, because we've turned the template, we folded it over. So now it's upside down. Our template is facing right side up like this, but once we fold it over on the line, then the template becomes upside down. So all we need to do, this is the lines, or the text is right side up. All we need to do is just turn it around like this. So the text is upside down. And this is hopefully the only time that you will ever be confused with foundation paper piecing because it's really quite simple. This is just a trick to get so the lines go in the right direction. What I'm doing, I'm not paying attention to what is going on with this part of the template. I don't care what is going on here, just with the template only. I'm cutting into the middle of this fabric because I want something specific out of it. The next thing that I'm doing is the text is parallel to the raw edge of the fabric. What happens is if I turn this, let's see if I can do this without, I'm going to put a pin in here so that you can see what I'm talking about. So right now this is upside down to you, but if I turn this entire piece around, see now this is going the right direction. And once we would open it up, it'll go in the right direction. So here's what you need to know for directional fabric, is when you fold your template over, the fabric needs to be going in the opposite direction. So if you want it to be reading this way, you just need to turn it around 180 degrees and then line the raw edge of your template up with whatever direction you have this going. Don't worry about anything going on here. Just what you have in this little section. And then what we are going to do is we are going to be really brave and we're going to cut our 1/4 inch, and I'm going to actually, because I have the pin in there where I want it to go, that is stationary, and I'm going to be super brave and cut in between these here. So there's about our 1/4 inch little area there. And I'm just looking to make sure that I have plenty. And then I'm going to move this over here and I'm going to just trim this off. Again, because all I need is just what is in this little section right there. But I want to have it something that is going to be manageable. So before I sew this, I want you to see how this is going to work out. Okay, so there would be the 1/4 inch line, and you can see that the text is going in the right direction now. So let's go ahead and repin this. We don't need to do anything else with the fabric. It doesn't need to be twisted around because it's where we want it to be. So all we need to do is open up the template and put our presser foot in the middle of the sew line. And sew a little bit before, a little bit after. Now this really will feel magical because we have the text going where we want it to be. And you'll feel like a pro. Okay, set that aside, and then we're going to go to H3. And remember that was the tree that I was going to kind of fiddle around with and decide where I wanted that to be. So now becomes the kind of fiddly part, but this is a really easy one. We're going to kind of follow the same method, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for, remember I didn't want to have this blue sky in that section. So whatever is in this section right here, so remember our right sides are together. And whatever we have with the template folded over, it's either folded this way or it's folded this way. Whatever is in this folded area, when it opens up, it will be right here. So fold this over, and I'm not too terribly concerned with what's going on outside. I'm concerned about what is going on the inside of this little tree part here. And I like where that is. So I'm going to pin this. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section down below and I will answer them either by text or I will answer with another video. So for this one, I think I am going, sometimes I don't trim these. It's pretty rare that I don't. So I am going to fold this back open and I am going to trim it. Because it really does help to follow the same method every single time. Now, if you are using the Directional Fabrics for this piece and you're wondering how do I test it to make sure that it's going to work, what I would do is I would increase your stitch length so that you have a basting stitch, and then you have less piercings in the fabric. And then you can see how it works out. The other thing that you can do is you can put your fingers along the seam here and you can open it back up, or you can put some pins to see, is this going to be the way that I want it to be? So then you can make that decision before you actually sew. I'm going to trim some of the excess off, but I'm not cutting along the dashed line yet. Okay, so now we are going to sew the last one, and I have most of it already trimmed, but I need to trim the last bit. So we score along the solid line, fold over, and trim the excess. Now what I have is I have this burlap printed fabric, and again I want to make sure that it's going in the right direction. So what we'll do is we'll turn the template, because these get to be a little bit fiddly and I don't want the fabric to fold over. I'm just going to put just a little bit of glue. So this is another time that you do not want to line up. If you're using a directional fabric for the stairs, you don't want to line up with the raw edge, because what will happen is it will be going in the wrong direction. So you'll have lines for your other bit, and then all of a sudden you'll have part of the stairs that drop off, and it will look really, really funny. So we have our template like this, and we fold over the part just like we're going to put everything together, and then we're going to turn it around. And we know that this needs to be the bottom part down here. So what we will do is we'll use the lines in the fabric as our cue for whether it's straight or not. And I'm purposefully using extra fabric here so that you can see and so that I can see that there is plenty of room here. And again, we're concerned with only what is going on in this section. This part is going to be cut off. So this part down here is what is going to be opened up when the seams are put together. So I can see that this looks like it's going kind of in the right direction, and you could be really exact, but I think there's enough variation in here that if I'm not perfectly in line, it's going to be okay. So then, what I need to do is trim this off. Sometimes I get caught talking and I forget that I actually need to follow my rules. I have my rules in place for a particular reason, and things go together really well. So all I did was I left my template right where it was, and then I just trimmed the same way I have been trimming all of the other pieces. Make sure that when you pin, you're not moving the fabric at all. And then the other thing that you need to be cognizant of is when you are sliding your template onto your sewing machine throat, that the fabric doesn't get caught and doesn't get rolled over. Sometimes that happens. So I don't really have a good tip for that because I still sometimes have it happen. So just be cognizant of when you put the template onto your sewing machine that you haven't had the fabric flip under. And if you have that happen, then all you need to do is just take out a few stitches and sew back over the top. And this piece is kind of wanting to pop up a little bit, so we'll put my log clapper on it for a second. And like I said, you might just want to sew over this with a basting stitch at first. Just sew one seam, make sure it's how you want it to be, then sew or with a basting stitch, and then go back over it with a shorter stitch and become comfortable with it. But this is not a technique that is so difficult that you will not be able to achieve this relatively quickly. It might take a little bit the first time, but this is really, really simple. I would not be teaching this to you if I was not confident that you could easily get this and you could easily be successful with it. So trim around, same method as before. You line up your 1/4 of an inch marking with the solid sew line, and then you trim along the edge of the ruler. And there you have it, directional piecing, and it'll all come together really, really nicely. I hope this is really helpful for you. Okay, so what we are going to do now is we're going to take all of these pieces. Hopefully I have all of them. And we're going to line them up according to this. Now remember that this is going to be the front and this is going to be the back. So what I lay down here will be the opposite. Okay, so E goes on the inside and F goes on the outside. D goes next to C. C is up at the top. B goes below C. And here we have A. Now A is on the right on this picture and on the left over here because it's just the mirror. And make sure that you do pay attention to where they are. Otherwise, you will sew them in the right place. And see, that was one that I was setting down in the wrong place. All right, so we're going to take a look at the instructions now that we have everything laid out where, and a kind of a rough idea of where it's going to be sewn. And when you lay it out, it's also a good time to look over to make sure that you have sewn everything and you're not missing any bits that need to be sewn together. So we are going to put E to F, and what we'll do is we'll look here and we'll see that E needs to be on the inside and F needs to be on the outside. So that's what we have here. And the other thing that you can do is you can look to see that E3 is next to F2. And with these little pieces, what I am going to do is I'm going to set the presser foot on top of where this is going to be sewn. I'm going to take care that any sliding that I do is not going to shift anything. And maybe it did shift a little bit. If you have a more narrow presser foot, that might be beneficial. And then for this piece, if you're a fast sewer, make sure that you do sew slowly so that nothing shifts. And just take your time going over this. And we're going slowly because we don't want them to shift, not because it's too thick. Okay, so then the next thing that I do is I remove these tabs, or the seam allowance. Sometimes in my videos I call it the danger zone, because you don't want to have too little fabric in this area. You want to make sure that there's enough for it to hold on to. So remove the seam allowance for only the piece that you have just sewn. So we're not going to remove these seam allowances because we have not yet stitched them. And then the next thing that you will do is remove the fabric, or not the fabric. Fabric needs to stay. We need to remove the paper in F2 because we're going to press the seam allowances open, and then that part becomes hidden and we won't be able to fish it out later. So for the little bits, I like to remove them in advance, and we're going to have a little bit of a hard time with E3 fishing that out, but we will just make it work a little bit later. We still need to have the seam allowance in E3, so I'm not going to be too terribly concerned. And it says press seams open, and the reason I like to press the seams open instead of to one side is it helps to distribute the excess bulk. And it just makes it easier when you're sewing multiple pieces together. And I'm going to use my log clapper to help dissipate some of the heat and to give a little bit of extra gravity and help it to stay put. Now, one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to double check these to make sure that I have the right pieces on all of them. Have the text in the right place. Okay. So then the next instructions say to sew G to EF, which are these two here. And I line up the outsides of the template. And again, I like to pin away from the seam allowance so that I can leave the pins while I sew, and I can just pull back a little bit and it's still going to hold on, and I can just sew right along the line and not have to worry about the fabric or anything shifting. So I'm just adjusting this because it didn't pick up the fabric underneath. You might find that you need to do just a little bit of adjusting. And then again, set the presser foot down on top of where you will be sewing. And for this, I'm sewing basically from one edge to the other. When you're joining your pieces together, you want to have a little bit more of edge-to-edge seams as opposed to going a little bit before to a little bit after. You want to make sure that those really stay put. And we'll remove these pieces. I don't remove all of the paper template. I will remove probably about 90% of it, and then the rest of it comes out when you wash it. And I'm going to take out these little bits. You know, the paper will just dissolve. So that's why I'm not too terribly concerned about this tiny E3 section. But if I can try to remove the paper that becomes really more of a pain in the rear is the parts that get stuck here where it's open, because it inhibits it from folding flat. So sometimes I take a little bit of extra time just to get those parts out, and then, like I said, everything else kind of comes out in the wash. Okay, and then the same on G, that we'll just remove the paper there. And then we're going to press toward G. again, let gravity kind of do its thing. Then we're going to take D, as in dog, and that will go to E, F, G. And these ones, what I do is I look to see underneath, does it matter what is going on as far as these lining up on the on this seam right here, and these two pieces are not going to be dependent on each other. So what I am going to do, again, I'm going to pin farther back and lay the template where it needs to go. And with this up here, I'm not concerned that it doesn't touch because this is going to be inside of the pieces right here. So that will all be covered. All right, and we'll remove the seam allowances here and flip it over. And we can't remove the E1 part here because that goes to another seam allowance. And it says to press the seams open, and these will press open really nicely. And then we set this one aside because we're done with this one for right now. So the next ones that we need are B and C. And if you have any of these little bits that are popping up, just go ahead and put a little bit of glue under the fabric. On the paper side usually is what I do. And then that'll really help it to stay in place. And then this one doesn't matter so much what is going on underneath, but I do want to make sure that these are as centered as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this part of the template where it kind of starts to bend in a little bit, and I'm going to use that as where it needs to be along the side of the part of C. So then that is in the middle. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Basically make sure that B is centered on C. Remove your seam allowance. And you could remove the C1 section here, but it's large enough that I think it'll be fine, that you can do it later. It shouldn't be that much of a problem. Now sometimes these pieces, even though it says press the seams open, these really do not want to be pressed open. If you can get it to press open nicely, do, which means that you'll just have to kind of keep massaging these. It'll just make the block look so much prettier if you can get them to lay open. Again, that's why I used the log clapper. And if you haven't seen any previous videos, there's really nothing special about the log clapper. It came out of my backyard when we were trimming some branches. This is a rather large branch, but we were just trimming up some branches on a tree in our yard. So I just like to use that one to give it some weight and hold it down. Anyway, if you can press the seams open, the block will just look so much nicer and crisper, and it'll just come together a little bit easier. All right, we have these. So then it says join B to C, join A to BC. So we have our BC section and we have A. Now this one might be a little bit more dependent on what is going on. So what I do is I put my thumb over where I think these two pieces should match up. And then I do have a look at the front, and I can see that A and B really should match up here. So I'm going to do my best. I just keep shifting it to where it needs to be. I just keep my thumb right over the seam where these pieces are going to be sewn together. So we're going to make sure that that's nice and crisp, and I like where that is, so I try not to shift anything. This is where I really become obsessed, if you will, with pins. And then you can see that the sewing pins are back far enough so that I should be able to sew over the seam and not remove them. And sometimes that helps the templates to really stay in place. And then I just go slow when I get by the pins. Make sure that I don't nick them. Okay, and then remove these little seam allowance areas. That one came out nice and easy. And then I have this little section just in here. It must be 5, and I don't think I'm going to worry too much about it. It really is not going to. It is so little. I think it'll be okay. Oh look, that's nice. That came together really nicely. And it says press seams open, but this one really is wanting to be pressed to one side. So I'm pressing towards A3. And that's fine. If your seams really prefer to go in one direction, that'll be totally fine. Okay, so then we take the D, E, F, G, and the same thing here, and we can see that D, E, F, G, here, right in here, they should try to match up. So let's see if we can give that a go. You should be able to. And we just kind of keep finessing, keep moving it down just a little bit to where you can see that they, that seam meets. And this is where I focus a lot of my attention rather than what is going on up on the edge of the block. We have a seam allowance because that will allow us to kind of move things around on the outside. We have enough to kind of shift things around. But I feel like we have really tried to make sure that all of the pieces, the seams inside of the templates are right on, that this just becomes the extra little detail to make sure that all of the pieces come together really nicely. If they don't, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. Your block will still look really, really nice. But I find that if I can take just a few extra seconds now, that I will be much happier with the end results because I've made sure that the seams on the inside come together. But if they don't and they're off by just a hair, I would leave it. If it's off by quite a bit, I would probably remove it, so then you're content. But if it's off by just a little bit, you probably are not going to notice when it's all put together. And certainly when you put lots of other blocks together, I hope you won't notice. And don't point out your mistakes or flaws to anybody else. Okay, there we go. Oh, I didn't even check to see. And I think that's close enough that I'm not going to rip it out because the seam is just going to hide all of that, you know, where it folds over. It's really, really close. We're going for closeness. We're not going for exactness. Now the top of this one is done, and I'm just pressing it to one side because there's a lot going on and those pieces have decided that they want to be going in one direction, not the direction that I want them to, but that's okay because it's all going to come together and it's all going to be beautiful. Okay, J to K, and I'm making sure that with J and K, the top of the templates match up. Because we're going to be sewing the top and the bottom section together, that's kind of how you decide which ones are more important to sew together. So I'm not going to worry about anything going on down here. I want to make sure that the top edge will have a nice straight line, and then the side will also have a nice straight line so that when it's open, it'll lay flat. It won't be too wonky. And we have to leave this section here in J2 because it hasn't been sewn yet to the top portion of the block. And let's press these open. Okay, now we're going to take M, and that will go to J and K. And again, the top of the block, top of the pieces should be flush. And I'm going to give a peek on the inside. I think that I should be fine. These ones don't really matter if they meet, and either way, because these are trees, they will look fantastic because trees are all very different. And I think it's kind of fun when there's so much variation. It doesn't, things like trees don't have to come out exactly all the time. One question that I get asked quite a bit is, do I remove papers before I put blocks together? And some people say yes, remove papers. Most will say no, and I am in the camp of yes, remove all of the little bits of paper before you sew the blocks together. I have had more times than not that it doesn't matter how precise I am with my sewing within the block, with my cutting of the block. It can be exactly whatever the pattern says. And I still have issues that sometimes one is a little bit different than the other and they have to be eased together. I find that it's so much easier for me to remove all of the papers and starch the block so it's a little bit stiffer, and then I piece all of the blocks together. That works out so much better for me because I can ease so much more easily without the paper there. If you want to leave the paper in, try it both ways and see what works best for you, but I have found for me removing all of the papers and then sewing just the fabric together when I'm sewing the blocks together works so much better than if I leave the papers in. Plus, I also really do not like removing the papers, which is so funny. I love foundation paper piecing, but I cannot stand removing all of the papers, especially when I have a whole quilt or a whole, 2 whole rows. It just really drives me crazy. So find out what works best for you. There isn't a right or a wrong answer in this situation. It's really what works best for you. Now for L1, or L, that will be the next one that goes to JKLM. You want to make sure that you'll have a straight line along the side of the memorial toward this center. So that's where you want to focus your attention. So use the same tip of putting your fingers just on the inside, maybe your fingernails right up along the seam line, and then fold it back and forth a few times. You'll get an idea of where it needs to be, but these little pieces of fabric, or the little corners rather of the template, are not as precise as I would like them to be, but because the blocks are so little, I think that's why there's a little bit of a variance. So just make sure that you're checking to see where the outside should be, rather than using the outside of the little cutouts and tabs as your baseline. And you can see that forms a really nice right angle. And we're going to press this one toward L. While that is gravitizing, I'm going to sew I and H together. And with this one, if the top and the bottom match, the inside should as well. I find that by removing these seam allowance parts now, that the block lays flatter as I'm putting the seams together. Now this one, it says to press the seams open, but I'm feeling like I didn't sew quite along the line as much as I should have, and there's a little bit of a puckering. So if you have a pucker, not a seam pucker, but there's just kind of a bulge in your template, and you have another piece that needs to be sewn. So you have one on one side and then one on the other side. What you can do is you can wait to press this until you have the one on the other side, and then it will distribute the pressure evenly, and then you'll minimize that pucker. But if I press it now, the paper will shift and the fabric will shift. This is another reason why I really like to use the glue stick, is because it helps to minimize any of that, any of this shifting. It can still happen, but it's really minimized. And one thing that you could even do, I think this will press well, you could remove the papers on the bottom if you're really having a problem with it not wanting to press nicely. Now I pressed these open, and I'm going to press J1 or J, I, and H toward J and H toward I. All right, so now what we will do is with this part, when you're putting the top and the bottom sections together, it does really become necessary to make sure that you are lining up the lines. So I'm going to line up the inside seams first. I'm starting with the edge of the memorial, and I'm using my same little trick of putting my thumb along the seam, and I have lifted it a little bit, and generally I don't recommend lifting it because things can shift quite easily, but I do need to make sure that I get the pin where I need it to be. That's kind of another reason that sometimes I will pin farther back, is because I can reduce some of that bulk by pinning farther back. And if you need to do any easing, make sure that the easing is on the bulk of the fabric for easing is on the bottom, and the part that has less fabric is on the top. Again, I'm going over to the side, and I'm going to pin on this side first. I'm not going to be concerned about anything that is going on the outside of the block. If these don't match up, it's not going to bother me. Again, I want to make sure that the inside lines on the block match up. And make sure that you don't get the pin underneath of your nail, because ouch. And you probably are not going to be able to see me peeking underneath. I do have one of these that is just really being a stinker, and it does not want to line up here. I would not remove the papers here to stitch them together. That would just cause a little bit too much shifting, and I think you would be really unhappy and discouraged with how it turned out. Okay, so now I will take the outsides and I will pin those and make sure that they match up. Try to get the bottom paper if you can. If you can't, then that's perfectly fine. And we'll just take this nice and easy as we sew along. If you have any of your seam allowances that have been pressed in one way or the other and they start to move, I stop and I lift up my foot with the needle in the down position. I lift up the foot and I just adjust it so that it goes where I want it to. The other thing that is really important is make sure that you are not pushing your template through, that you're allowing the feed dogs to do that work for you. What will happen is you'll have some shifting, or you can also have stitches become too large. And it's not the end of the world. If you have that happen, you can just sew back over it. Okay, so then this is where it becomes really, really magical. You can open it up and you can see that, ta-da! Turned out really nicely. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below. I would love to help you. I have new patterns that come out absolutely every month. We are going through the national parks in the United States and Canada, and I have a monthly subscription where you can get 3 patterns, and they're delivered to your Fiona Sandwich account, and you can join with me. And I would love to see all of your blocks. Post them to Instagram with the hashtag National Park Quilt, or tag me at Fiona Sandwich. I will see you in the next video.